All right, today I'm going to talk about an American poet, William Cullen Bryant, and his best-known poem, a poem called Thanatopsis. Okay, by looking at the picture on the title page, you might be able to guess the general subject of this poem, but we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Who was William Cullen Bryant? As you can see by his life dates, he was born after the United States became independent. He grew up in New England, in the state of Massachusetts, in a fairly conservative household, a Puritan family. However, they were not exceptionally well off, and therefore Bryant's desire to complete a university education was not possible. He began writing poetry at a fairly young age, and in fact, he wrote the poem that we're going to read, going to examine. He started writing it as a teenager. Because he could not finish university, he was obliged to enter a profession, and he began studying law and eventually became a lawyer and did this job for a number of years. Also, as you can see by his life dates, he was influenced by the Romantic movement, and this certainly has an impact on the poem and on the way we might interpret it. What about the publication of this work? It actually was begun when Bryant was only a teenager, but it was not published until 1821. And when it was published, it was very popular. Bryant wrote several volumes of poetry, but he never really regained the popularity or the acclaim that he got from his earliest work. He was nonetheless admired by a number of 19th century figures, including Walt Whitman and Edgar Allan Poe, both of whom praised his work. The quote from an essay by Michael Branch suggests that Bryant's reputation has declined somewhat. Branch writes, "In his own day, Bryant was beloved in a way that no American writer is today. More than simply a well-known author, Bryant was seen as an agent of entertainment and edification." Okay, well, this status has not continued. And today, when we read anthologies, we typically only see his poem Thanatopsis and not his other work. What does this word mean? It's an unusual word. The source language of the word is Greek, and the root thanatos is the root word for death. Opsis, which is related to words like optic or optical in English today, is related to seeing, to viewing. In this case, the title has a metaphoric or a figurative meaning, a meditation upon death. I should add, later in life, Bryant became very well known as a journalist, and this, in fact, was his major job for most of his life, as an editor for the New York Evening Post, a paper that, in fact, is still in existence. All right, if we look at the overall poem, it's not a very long poem, 82-line poem, but I think the poem can be divided into four principal areas, okay? So I'm going to talk about these briefly and read some portions of the poem, trying to summarize what I think is the major intention of these different parts, and to talk about a couple of abstract or philosophical ideas that the poem raises. And finally, to pose a few questions, to leave you with these questions that you might think this over yourself if you read the poem in more detail. So the sections that I've identified, I've broken down by line number. First, dealing with nature. What is our relationship to nature? What can nature do for us? Then the primary theme of the poem, death, and specifically what happens to the body after death, and what should we think about the fate of the soul, or what's left over after the body is gone. Then a fairly lengthy characterization of what Bryant thinks death means. So once you're dead, what's that like? And who are you with? And what is your condition? Okay, this is the kind of the heart of the text. And then finally, an injunction. An injunction is a command or a request or a recommendation to live in a certain way, in a certain relationship to death. Now, the first theme is the theme of nature, which of course is a very profound romantic theme. And in this picture, which is a painting by a guy named Durand, so there's an American painter, we already see a kind of complex relationship to nature. We see human beings in nature, but they're kind of small. Nature is quite big. Is nature threatening? Is nature something that the human beings are part of, they're integrated into? Is nature dangerous? Is nature nurturing? I think we might interpret this picture as supporting any or all of these claims. And in fact, Bryant, too, seems to have a kind of a divided sense of what nature means. We look at the first 17 lines and speak to some of the meanings of this text. We can see this already. To him who in the love of nature holds, so nature is personified, it's a capital N, so nature is like a person with a relationship to us. So to start again, to him who in the love of nature holds communion with her visible forms, she speaks a various language. For his gayer hours she has a voice of gladness and a smile and eloquence of beauty, and she glides into his darker musings with a mild and gentle sympathy that steals away their sharpness ere he is aware. And thoughts of the last bitter hour come like a blight over thy spirit, and sad images of the stern agony, and shroud and pall and breathless darkness, and the narrow house make thee to shudder and grow sick at heart. Go forth under the open sky and list to nature's teachings, while from all around, earth and her waters and the depths of air, comes a still voice. Now, I've read all of this to give you a sense of how these opening lines create the major thematic problem of the text. What's being said? What's the speaker really saying to us? Well, death is frightful. Death is a terrible and inevitable end of human life. And what should we do when we are confronted by this anxiety, confronted by this worry? Bryant's speaker suggests that we go into nature and that we take communion with. That's an important word. What is communion suggestive of in the text? Okay, well, communion has a religious overtone. So also we have this theological or religious feeling or sense to the text. Nature is a kind of religious principle, but it's an unusual principle. Bryant doesn't say nature is God, right? But nonetheless, it does have a religious flavor. This word communion, by the way, we can see is the word we use for the Eucharist, meaning a Christian ceremony, which in this picture you can see Jesus giving the bread and the wine to his followers. This is an important Christian ritual. So communion has different levels of meaning here, and nature is clearly taking on this sort of religious role. All right. We move on to what I call the second section of the poem. I'm not going to read the whole thing, only a few lines. Earth that nourished thee shall claim thy growth, to be resolved to earth again, and lost each human trace, surrendering up thine individual being, shalt thou go. Well, got bad news for you. You're going to die, and the body's going to fall apart, decay, and return to the earth. Well, that's nothing surprising. But of course, the real question is anything else left? Is there a soul? Is there an identity? Is there an ego that somehow outlasts the body? Or is the relationship of the body actually suggesting a larger, more profound and philosophical relationship that we don't see on the surface of the poem? I think the second one is probably what Bryant is getting at. So the fate of the body, right? The loss of the body, but the anxiety in the poem, I think, is, do we lose our individuality? Do we lose our ego, our personality? Or is there some kind of soul that lasts after the loss of physical being? Okay, this brings us to this central section in which he talks about the nature of death. What is it like to be dead? Line 66 to 73. As the long train of ages glide away, the sons of men, the youth in life's green spring, and he who goes in the full strength of years, matron and maid, the bowed with age, the infant in the smiles and beauty of his innocent age cut off, and so on and so on. He's suggesting that all of us are going to die, no matter what our status, no matter what our sex, no matter what our age. Each of us is susceptible to death. What is the nature of death, though? Not a sorrowful, terrible, isolating, alienating experience, but an experience that levels us in the sense that we lie down with patriarchs, with kings, with the wise, and with the good. The world is one vast grave, which Bryant calls, quote, the great tomb of man, and therefore death is a kind of unifying experience in which we take communion with other people, with the great of the earth who have passed before us. Now, the philosophical and theological problem that's suggested by this, that we become one with the earth and one with those who have gone before, suggests an idea called pantheism. This is a key word that is associated with this poem. So Bryant's understanding of the body and its relationship to death and to the universe suggests a pantheistic theology or pantheistic philosophy. What does this word mean? Well, pan is a prefix suggesting all or completeness or unification, and theos is a Greek word meaning God. And we can contrast this way of thinking with some other types of religious ideas that were prevalent at the time, as well as with atheism. And this is done, I think, effectively. I should mention one of the earliest figures associated with pantheism was Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher. But this diagram gives us a sense of how human beings or the universe are related to God and the differences that arise from this. Theism, the first category, suggests that God creates the universe and that God has a direct impact or relationship to that universe. Deism, which was a popular belief in the late 18th century in America, suggests that although God creates the universe, God stays away from that universe, does not influence it or affect it directly. I'm going to skip the third category and go to the fourth one. Pantheism suggests that God is the universe, that there is no real distinction between the nature of the universe and God, which then suggests that we are in fact part of God. This is part of our larger notion of being in the world. Atheism, the fifth category, as you may be aware, is a universe in which God is absent. Okay, the other categories, the third and the sixth one, we will ignore here. This shows you then some different orientations and the suggestion that Bryant is in fact a pantheist. That seems to be his dominant feeling. We move on to the end of the poem then. He gives us a suggestion about how we should look upon death, what kind of attitude we should cultivate towards it. So live that when thy summons comes to join the innumerable caravan, that means when it's time to die, which moves to the pale realms of shade, where each shall take his chamber in the silent halls of death, thou go not like the quarry slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but, sustained and soothed by an unfaltering trust, approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. That's the end of the poem. So what's the resolution? Essentially that the speaker enjoins us to approach death without worry and anxiety, and he uses a very traditional simile, namely that death is like sleep. Okay. So finally, what is the overall tone of Bryant's poem? It's essentially a meditative poem which suggests the genre of elegy. An elegy is a meditative lament, usually over the death of someone, possibly a particular person, which has a serious and emotional tone, but nonetheless moves from a negative or anxious feeling to a positive and universal feeling. And therefore, I think Bryant's poem resembles an elegy in form. Meditative, serious, and moving from the anxiety of worry over death to a feeling of unification with the universe, a positive change over the course of the poem. A few questions arise, I think, that we can leave this poem with. One is, why would such a young man write a poem whose subject is death and the end of the body? This is a curious thing for a young person to be obsessed with. The second is, what is the nature of the ego that survives death? What actually does outlast the body? Bryant does not give us a clear answer on this. And so with these questions, I close this discussion. Thank you.